Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy. I'm Roy Lawson. We're in a series that I'm calling When You Don't Feel Like Smiling. Today's specific issue is this one. Why don't they like me? Our primary scriptures are Matthew 7, 1 through 3, and John 15, 18 to 25. From Jewish folklore comes this poignant tale of unfair rejection. A young man is riding on the train to Lublin, Poland. Another man is nearby, and he tries to make small talk with him. He's an older man, a merchant. He opens with a surefire conversation starter. Can you tell me the time? The merchant tells him in direct terms where he can go. What? I ask you a simple question and you answer with rudeness. What's the matter with you? The merchant explains. All right, I'll tell you what's the matter. You ask me a question. I have to give you an answer, no? That starts a conversation. We talk about the weather, politics, business, and so on. One thing leads to another. It turns out you're a Jew. I'm a Jew. I live in Lublin. You're a stranger there. Out of hospitality, I invite you to my home for dinner. You'll meet my daughter. She's a beautiful girl. You're a handsome young man. You date a few times. You fall in love. Finally, you come to ask for my daughter's hand in marriage. So why go to all that trouble? Let me tell you right now, young man, I won't let my daughter marry anyone who doesn't even own a watch. Rejection. Who hasn't asked, why don't they like me? Let's think about a few possible answers. It may be they don't like you because you're in the wrong. I stopped briefly to pick up something at a local shopping center, and when I returned to my car, I found a small yellow card beneath the windshield wiper. On it was this professionally printed message. Thanks for taking 2 parking spaces. I had to park 2 blocks away, you stupid, inconsiderate moron. Well, I could feel my face turning red. Whether from embarrassment or indignation, I wasn't sure. I like to think I'm a considerate driver. So I checked. Sure enough, I was right on the line. It was possible for a car to squeeze into the space beside me, but with difficulty. Guilty as charged. Let's face it, sometimes our critics are right, and we're wrong. It's the hardest kind of criticism to take. So we get defensive. We blame our accuser, indignantly point out that he has no right to point out our flaws, since he's so full of them himself. We can even hurl scripture at him. You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. That's in Romans chapter 2. Well, this makes you feel better. Still, you may be wrong. Or it may be that you aren't likable. Are you too loud? Too boastful? Too sullen? Too moody? Are you hypocritical, pretending a piety that you don't practice? Or does your piety demean others that you think are not as spiritual as you are? Does your language, either pious or profane or too plain or too pretentious or whatever, make other people feel uncomfortable? Do you have a critical spirit? Here are Jesus' words on the subject. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same manner that you judge, or the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And then he goes on in this very famous passage. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Nobody likes hanging around critical, negative people. So the first question to ask is, have I in some way made myself unlikable? Am I too judgmental? Or the problem may be because you're not one of them. A second question that could be asked of all of us, couldn't it? Could it be because I'm different from them? I'm not one of them. Jesus warned his disciples not to expect to be appreciated. If the world hates you, he said, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I've chosen you out of the world. That's why the world hates you. Jesus is speaking specifically of his and his disciples' persecutors. But the warning applies broadly, doesn't it? Think of terrorism, for example. It's been with us for a long time because it feeds on hatred, and there's plenty of that to go around. The terrorist message is clear. I hate you because you're not like me. This hatred is at the root of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism and racism and ageism and sexism and political, religious, and class wars of every distinction. When Joy and I were in India, we spent a day at the beach in the south of India. Our hostess was an exceptional tour guide. She taught us a lot about Indian culture. She treated us to a snack in a restaurant. At another table were a group of 4 or 5 men. Our hostess explained that they were from North India. We couldn't see how she could tell. Oh, that's easy, she said. North Indians are lighter skinned than South Indians. We studied them more closely. And then we looked at her and back at them. We couldn't tell the difference. In fact, if anything, she, a South Indian, was fairer skinned than they were. Her culture had taught her to make these fine distinctions, had taught her that they are not like us. Back home in America, we could have easily categorized people in ways that would have thoroughly confused her. Every culture teaches these lessons of discrimination. Do you know these immortal lines? Believe as I believe, no more, no less. That I am right, and no one else confess. Feel as I feel, think only as I think, eat what I eat, drink what I drink, look as I look, do always as I do, and then, and only then, I'll fellowship with you. Charles Swindoll, from whom I borrowed these lines, reported on 2 churches of different denominations in a small town. They finally decided they'd be better off if they'd merge. The small community didn't need 2 churches. So they started merger talks, but they had to call them off. They couldn't agree on, of all things, the Lord's Prayer. One group insisted that the proper wording was, forgive us our trespasses. And the other was adamant, it had to be, forgive us our debts. Since neither group could forgive the other's trespasses or debts, in this difference of opinion, the deal was over. They aren't like us. One again. In such little absurdities as this fight over a couple of nouns, or in the great atrocities like international terrorism, the cause is the same. If you're not like me, you're wrong, and I'll have nothing to do with you, except maybe to do away with you. You, therefore, must be perfect, as I am perfect. Another reason that they don't like me may be because of their guilt. I mentioned the principle of psychological projection earlier. It simply states the obvious, that we most quickly condemn in others the fault that we're guilty of. Jesus is referring to it when he talks about the plank or the beam in our eye. A literal illustration of this has been provided by Sir Percival Lowell, famed astronomer. He announced in 1877 that there were canals on Mars. He had heard that an Italian astronomer had seen straight lines crisscrossing the Martian surface. So, in 1877, he began devoting himself for the rest of his life to mapping the channels and canals he saw there. He believed they proved that there was intelligent life on Mars. And his teachings were universally accepted. But when the 20th century space probes orbited Mars and landed on its surface, no canals were there, no channels were to be found. How could Lowell have been so wrong and so certain? We now know that Sir Percival suffered from a rare eye disease, which now is named Lowell's syndrome after him, that made him see the blood vessels in his own eyes. The canals that he saw were the projections of his own veins. And that's how psychological projection works. We see in others what's wrong in us, and we criticize them. Well then, what's a Christian to do? This is the real question, isn't it? Since we can't escape being criticized, we want to know how to deal with it, don't we? I want to propose 6 actions that have helped me. First one, listen. There might be some truth in what they're saying. Listen. When I was in college, one of my dorm mates took it upon himself to let me know everything he thought was wrong with me. He was quite thorough. His charges stung, I confess. But of course, I didn't let him know that he got to me. Later, though, that same day, I went up a floor and asked another dorm mate, a trusted friend, about what I'd been told. And to my surprise, he agreed with my critic. I was glad then that I hadn't become too defensive. I needed to hear this. You see, sometimes your critics are right. Another action, laugh. If you don't take yourself too seriously, your critics can't wound you too seriously. Here's a letter that I received. It's been around for years. It purports to be from a Reverend Elton Johns of the Rescue Mission in Canton, Ohio. It was addressed to me. My dear friend in the Lord, perhaps you have heard of me in my nationwide campaign in the cause of temperance. Each year for the past 14 years, I have made a tour of Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio. I've delivered a series of lectures on the evils of drinking. On this tour, I've been accompanied by my friend and assistant, Clyde Lindstrom. Clyde, an excellent young man of good family and excellent background, is a pathetic example of a life ruined by excessive indulgence in whiskey and women. Clyde would appear with me at the lectures and sit on the platform, wheezing and staring at the audience through bleary, bloodshot eyes, and sweating profusely and babbling incoherently, while I would point him out as an example of what overindulgence can do to a person. Last summer, unfortunately, Clyde died. A mutual friend has given me your name, and I wonder if you would be available to take Clyde's place on my winter tour. What fun I've had with this letter. This is what I often do with criticism. I laugh. What do you do when people laugh at you? Well, here's my suggestion. Beat them to the draw. Laugh first. So you're not as tall as you'd like to be? Laugh about it. So your car is so old the dealer offers you money not to trade it in? Laugh about it. So your health isn't as dependable as it used to be? Laugh about it. So you weren't the first in your class? Laugh about it. I have a friend who has brightened many a conversation with his one-liner about his IQ. I'm not doing so bad for a 78, he would say. So you think you're funny looking? Haven't you noticed that almost everybody is? I'm the only one, for example, in my family who isn't. And they disagree with me. So you're afraid they'll find your flaws? Point them out before they do. If you're already laughing at yourself, somebody else's laughter at you can't hurt you. Here's another. Remember the critic's fate. There was a young musician whose concert was poorly received by critics. They panned it. After he stung for a while, the Finnish composer, Jean Sibelius, patted him on the shoulder and said, "Remember, son, there's no city in the world where they have erected a statue to a critic. It's the critic's fate to be forgotten. There are sports writers and literary critics and drama critics and food critics, but they're all on the sidelines, watching. They aren't in the play." Be thankful. After all, they think you're important enough to criticize you, or they wouldn't bother. Politicians know this. It doesn't bother them so much to be openly opposed as to be quietly ignored. I had to give this advice to a church I served in Arizona. In the early days, Central Christian was a cozy little group of people meeting in a cozy little building. The church could do whatever the members wanted and nobody noticed. Then the church grew. And as the growth came, so came the criticism. Look at what they're doing over at that church. Who do they think they are at that church? After a while, the congregation couldn't do anything without attracting attention and objection. But here's the truth. You can't escape criticism if you're doing what the Lord wants you to do. But you can reserve the right to choose what your critics are going to criticize you for. When the Lord got a hold of Saul of Tarsus and turned him into Paul, the apostle, from then on, Paul was besieged by negative attacks. But his response is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18. Give thanks in all circumstances. So, be thankful. And turn the mud they're slinging into a merit badge. I picked up this little idea from the police back in the 1960s and 1970s when, like our day today, demonstrators frequently hurled verbal abuse at policemen trying to control unruly crowds. Their favorite epitaph then was, "Pigs. You cops are pigs." Well, one policeman didn't take offense. He said, "Of course we're pigs. That stands for patience, integrity, and guts." That's what you do. Turn their mud into a merit badge. Clear back in the beginning when people were hissing Christians as a term of contempt, disciples of Jesus accepted the term and made it one of honor. And then finally, stay close to the source of your strength. Serve the Lord and Him only, in spite of the critics. Thomas Edison was a lifelong Republican, but when Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was running for the presidency, Edison voted for him. His friends were astonished. And then he explained. They say Wilson has blundered. Well, I reckon he has. But I notice he always blunders forward. The critics of the church frequently say the church has blundered and Christians are blundering. Well, they're right. But when you think about it, we do seem to be blundering in the right direction, don't we? If we're moving toward Christ. And it's that sense that we have, that in spite of our fumbles and bumbles, we are still moving closer to Christ, closer to the person Christ wants us to be. That gives us joy. I bid you joy.